Hey everyone, and welcome. Today, we're going to dive into a topic that, a lot of us have heard of, but maybe don't fully get. Learning disabilities. It's a term that gets thrown around a lot, but what does it really mean? Well, let's break it down together.
So here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll pin down exactly what a learning disability is. Then, we'll look at the specific challenges people face, touch on some related disorders, dig into the causes, and finally, and this is the important part, we'll talk about the different ways to provide support.
Okay, so let's get right into it. The first thing we need to be absolutely clear on is this. A learning disability has nothing, and I mean nothing, to do with how smart someone is or how hard they're trying. It's a recognized neurological condition. So here's a question that's been debated for a long time. Are these just, problems that show up at school or at home, or are they something more clinical? Well, modern psychology, especially the big diagnostic manual, the DSM-5, actually gives us a very clear answer.
And there it is. The official term is specific learning disorder, and it's classified as a neurodevelopmental disorder. That's a fancy way of saying it has a clinical status. It's a real, diagnosable condition that starts with how the brain develops. What's really useful about this slide is how it breaks down the core of it. First, these are permanent. They last a lifetime. They're internal, meaning they come from within the person, and they're biological, tied right into the central nervous system. It's also not just one thing. It's a whole group of different disorders that affect those key mental processes we need for learning. All right, let's move on. Since learning disability is such a big umbrella term, it's super important to understand the specific challenges that can fall under it. We're really talking about a whole spectrum of difficulties.
First up is the one you've probably heard of most, dyslexia. This is a reading disorder. The key thing to understand here is that the problem isn't with a person's eyesight, it's about how the brain processes words, recognizing them and making sense of the text. And this is how it often shows up in the real world. You might see someone reading really slowly or hesitantly. That classic mix-up between letters like B and D is a big one, or even reversing whole words. These aren't just careless mistakes, they're direct symptoms of how the brain is handling language. And this isn't some super rare thing either. About 4% of school children are affected by a reading disorder. Think about that. In an average classroom, there's a good chance at least one child is dealing with this every single day.
Okay, next up is dyscalculia. A simple way to think about it is like dyslexia, but for numbers. It's a mathematical disability where someone's ability with arithmetic is just way below what you'd expect for their age and intelligence.
And some of the common signs might be things like still using fingers to count when their friends have moved on, or really struggling to put numbers in the right sequence. They might even read numbers backwards or mix up plus and minus signs. Again, it's all about brain processing.
But learning challenges aren't just about what's on the page. They can also show up in how we speak. This table breaks down 4 main types, from having trouble both understanding and expressing language to just expressing it, to issues with pronouncing words correctly, and even the flow of speech, like stuttering.
Now let's zoom out for a second. It's really important to know that learning disabilities often don't happen in a vacuum. They can actually coexist with other developmental disorders, mainly because, it's all happening in the brain. And many of these conditions share some of the same underlying wiring.
One of those is autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. This is a condition tied to brain development that mainly impacts social communication and how a person interacts with others. The first signs usually appear really early, often before a child is even 3 years old. And to put this into a local context, a 2021 study from the Indian Journal of Pediatrics found some pretty incredible numbers. It estimated that 1 in every 68 children in the country has autism. And look at this, it's diagnosed about 3 times more often in boys than in girls.
Another condition that often comes up in the same conversation is ADHD. This one affects a pretty significant 8 to 10% of school children, and its main features are things like restlessness and a short attention span. You can just imagine how those traits could create real challenges in a typical classroom and how they might overlap with a specific learning disability.
So this all leads us to the big question, right? Why? Why do learning disabilities happen in the first place? Well, let's dig into that. Researchers usually break down the causes into 2 big buckets, which you can basically think of as nature versus nurture.
This slide lays it out perfectly. On one side, you have the biological factors. This is all about genetics, the physical structure of the brain and how it functions. And on the other side, you have psychological factors, which look at how our brain processes what we see and hear, and even how we're taught. The evidence for biology is pretty strong. For example, twin studies have confirmed that things like reading and spelling skills definitely have a genetic link. We also know these are neurological issues based in the central nervous system. There's even research looking at whether brain differences between genders could play a role.
Now, from the psychological side, some of the older theories pointed to things like perceptual deficits, the idea that kids were literally seeing letters backward. But a more modern theory actually flips the script. It suggests that maybe the problem isn't a deficit in the child, but a deficit in how we teach. The truth is, most experts today agree it's not one or the other. It's a complex dance between a person's biology and their environment.
Okay, so understanding the challenges and the causes is one thing, but what can we actually do about it? Let's get into our final section on pathways to support. And the good news here is that there are some really effective strategies that can make a world of difference. I really like this one. It's called a success-oriented approach, and it's brilliant because it's so simple. You take a big task and you just break it down into tiny, manageable pieces. The child only has to focus on one little part at a time. Once they've got that down, you move to the next. This builds momentum and, most importantly, confidence. For reading and writing issues specifically, there's the linguistic approach. This is all about going back to basics and building those foundational language skills in a logical way, like learning to tell letters apart, understanding the sounds they make, and putting it all together. And this support doesn't end when school does. For adults, things like getting recorded lectures can be a game changer. And that brings us to our final thought for today, which is really the heart of the matter. If we start seeing learning disabilities not as a deficit, but just as a difference in brain wiring, it changes everything. The question stops being, what's wrong with this person, and becomes, how do we build our classrooms, our workplaces, and our communities to support every kind of mind? And that, really, is the challenge for all of us. You know, when you start looking into childhood behavioral disorders, from aggression all the way to anxiety, you start to see something, a really curious and surprisingly consistent pattern. So what is it? Well, we're about to find out as we dive into what one particular psychology textbook has to say. Okay, let's get right into it. So here it is. This is the big question at the heart of our explainer today. The source material we're digging into points out this pretty significant gender difference, again and again, in case after case. But the real mystery is, why? Our guide for this journey is a psychology textbook from Sheth Ranchidlal Achar Law College of Arts and Commerce in Ahmedabad. And what's so fascinating is this isn't my analysis or some outside observation. The textbook itself is what keeps pointing this out, page after page. So first up, let's look at what are called externalizing behaviors. Basically, these are the disorders that show up as outward actions, the stuff you can clearly see. And believe me, the pattern becomes obvious almost immediately. Take the unsocialized aggressive reaction. It sounds like a mouthful, but it just covers a pattern of behavior like cruelty, being disobedient, and acting out in revenge. And the very first thing the source material points out is that it's, and I'm quoting here, more common in boys than girls. And what's really powerful about this, and something that textbook highlights, is how aggression changes as kids get older. I mean, look at this. A 3-year-old's tantrum, they lie on the floor, they scream. But a 12-year-old's aggression can escalate into something much more serious, like throwing stones at a bus or actually harming people. And yep, the pattern continues with what's called the runaway reaction. This is often tied to really tough family situations or feelings of neglect. And true to form, the textbook says this is more common in boys, although it does mention that the trend is on the rise for girls too. Now you might be thinking, okay, so this is all about boys acting out. But here's where it gets even more interesting. This pattern isn't just limited to external behaviors. It also shows up in more internalized struggles, the turmoil happening on the inside, things like anxiety and even speech difficulties. For example, let's look at the over-anxious reaction. This is defined by constant, unrealistic fears and really low self-confidence. You can see the symptoms right here. And what does the source explicitly state at the bottom? You guessed it, more common in boys. This slide does a fantastic job of clearing up the confusion between stuttering and stammering. Stuttering, that's the repetition of sounds, the I. Stammering is more of a blockage, which we'll get to in a second. But for stuttering, the textbook points to that now familiar pattern, more common in boys than girls. So let's quickly walk through what the source calls the deadlock of stammering. First, someone tries to speak a word. Then, this muscular tension just builds and builds, literally blocking the sound. And finally, that tension lets go, and the rest of the sentence just rushes out. It's a really intense physical process.
Okay, let's group together a few common habit disorders. We've got sleepwalking, which is also called somnambulism. We have nail biting, which is often a way to deal with stress, and enuresis, which we all know as bedwetting. And for every single one of them, the source material finds the exact same pattern. All of them are cited as being more common in boys.
Now, the textbook doesn't just stick to the traditional stuff. It actually gets into some really contemporary challenges. So let's see how these patterns might extend to some of today's addictive behaviors. The DSM-5, which is kind of the Bible of psychology, now classifies gambling disorder as a full-blown addiction. It's that uncontrollable need to keep gambling, even when everything is going wrong because of it. What's curious is that for these more modern addictions, the textbook doesn't actually specify that same gender breakdown, which makes you wonder.
The textbook even coins its own term for a phone obsession. Get this, mobile phonic disorder. And as you can see from this table, the impact of too much phone use is just huge. It ranges from physical problems like text neck, all the way to serious mental health struggles like anxiety and social isolation.
And to really hammer home how serious this is, the source gives this pretty stark warning. It says, quote, "Excessive mobile usage in children is prone to depression, anxiety, attention deficit disorder, autism, bipolar disorder, and psychosis." Wow, that really highlights the potential dangers we're dealing with today. Okay, so we've seen this pattern pop up over and over again. The obvious next question is, why? What's actually causing this? In our final section, let's try to connect the dots and look at the potential reasons mentioned in the textbook.
The textbook doesn't offer one simple, neat answer. Instead, it points to a whole constellation of factors that could be at play. Things like the family environment, parental rejection, or super strict discipline come up a lot. So do things like heredity, trauma, and just deep underlying feelings of insecurity. It really seems to be a complex mix of nature and nurture.
And so we end not with a simple answer, but with a bigger question for you to think about. Knowing that this pattern exists and understanding some of the pressures that might be behind it, how can we use that knowledge to better support every child, boy or girl? It's definitely something to reflect on. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.
Like, share and subscribe this channel now.